Hi and welcome to this video. Today again we will implement Google Login into our Angular app. This time using the OAuth/OpenID Connect method at the Google Identity platform. So basically when a user opens our page, he will be redirected to Google where he must log in. Then the user will be redirected to our page again and the Angular app will get an access token. Our Angular app has access to the Google user data such as name and email address and can access Google APIs on behalf of the user using the access token. We will use the open source library angular-auth2-oidc, which implements the standard OAuth2 and OpenID Connect protocol. First, let's clarify what actually is OAuth2 and OpenID Connect. OAuth2 is an industry standard for authentication with tokens. There is a client and an auth provider. The client wants to access restricted APIs. Roughly, there are two use cases for OAuth2. When a human user is a resource owner and is using a client which wants to access the user's data. The client redirects the user to an auth provider, the user enters his credentials and gives his consent so the client can access the restricted data. That way the client is working on behalf of the user. The other use case is a server-to-server communication, when a client is also the resource owner. This way the client has his own credentials and is also getting an access token from the auth provider and can use it on an API. With our Angular app we are in the first case. OpenID Connect is like an extension to OAuth2. For example, the client can get the discovery document from the auth provider. The discovery document is a configuration info for the client, so he knows what is the actual login URL, what is the endpoint to get the user info data, and so on. This reduces the manual configuration on the client side. Also, we can get user info data from an user info point. The Angular library, which we are going to use here, will handle all steps of the OpenID Connect protocol, forwarding the user to Google, getting the user info, refreshing the access token, and so on. Before we can start implementing, we must configure the client in the Google Cloud Console. Make sure that you have created and selected a project here. Then, here in the section menu, select the section APIs and Services. Then you can go to Credentials. And in here you have a list of OAuth2 client IDs. Right now we don't have any, but we can create one. Then click on Create and create an OAuth client ID. And right now Google tells me that I have to configure a consent screen. So before I can create a client ID, I must configure the consent screen. Here I must decide which user types I want to use my app. Only internal users which are assigned to my organization within the project, or external users, that means all Google users. So I decide to allow all Google users to use my app, and Google tells me that my application will be in a test phase where I will decide a list of test users until my application is ready for production and will be published to all users. So here I must put some general information like my application name, support email, and so on. At this step I must specify the scopes, that is, the permissions which my application requires from the user. The scopes define which data my application is allowed to access. This will be also displayed in the user consent screen. So I want to have the user email address, the user profile. Then I can go to the next step. And here I can add a list of test users. Then save. And that's it. And then I can go back to credentials. And I can now finally create an OAuth client ID. Select the application type. This is a web application. Give it a proper name. Here I must define authorized origins. Since I'm developing locally, that will be localhost. And authorized redirect URLs is also localhost. Then click on Create. And then I get a client ID and a client secret. We need only the client ID, so copy paste it and let's go. My application also wants to access the emails of the Google user. For that I must enable the Gmail API. For that I can go to Enable APIs and Services And then I can click on Enable APIs and Services, and then search here for Gmail. Select Gmail API, and click on Enable. Because I have enabled the Gmail API, I can go to the consent screen configuration and add the scope for Gmail read-only to my consent screen. Click on Edit App. Save and continue. Then add or remove scopes. And here I can search for Gmail. And what I need is, I need Gmail API read-only. And click on Update. And now the Gmail read-only scope is also added to this consent screen. Save. Now we have created an OAuth client ID and we have enabled a Gmail API. Now we can start to implement it. So now I have prepared an empty Angular project. And I'm going to use this library to implement Google Login. As you can see, this library supports OAuth2 and OpenID Connect. So I'm just going to execute this npm install command. And then we need to import some modules. At first the HTTP client module, and then the OAuth module. So having that OAuth module, we can finally configure and use the OAuth service. The OAuth service should be configured right at the beginning of the application. So probably the best practice in Angular is to use the app initializer pattern of Angular. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to create a regular Angular service and do everything Google related inside that service. So here I am injecting the OAuth service. In the constructor here, we're gonna configure the OAuth service and initialize the login process. The first thing we're gonna configure is the issuer. The issuer is the authorization provider. In that case, it should be Google. According to Google, this should be the issuer URL. So we're gonna copy and paste it. The library is going to contact that URL to get the OpenID Connect discovery document. The next thing I'm gonna do is set this flag to false, the strict discovery document validation. The reason behind that is that the library does a validation on the discovery document. It checks if all URLs are starting with the issuer URL. For Google, this is unfortunately not the case. Therefore, I turn the strict validation off. The next thing I'm going to configure is the redirect URL. This is the URL where the user is being redirected after he has logged in at Google. In that case, this is my application. The next configuration parameter is the client ID. Remember, we created a client in the Google Cloud Console. We copied the client ID, and this is the place where we paste it. We also must provide at least one scope. These are the standard scopes. This is nothing special, we just get the user profile and the user email address. Later we will also add the scope for Gmail API to read the user's emails. And now finally we can use that config object and configure the OAuth service. Just call the configure method of the OAuth service and provide this configuration object. Now we are going to call a sequence of other methods of the OAuth service. At first we must tell the service to load the discovery document. The service will contact Google and get the discovery document. After the discovery document has been loaded, I call the method try-login-implicit-flow on the OAuth service. This method does not initialize the login process. It only tries to find a token in the URL. You notice I say login implicit flow. There are actually two flows. One is an implicit flow and the other is the code flow. These flows differ in the way how the application acquires the access token. In the implicit flow, the access token is passed as a hash fragment in the URL. After that, we can check if the user has logged in. We can do that by using an if and use the OAuth service and check whether he has a valid access token. If he has not a valid access token, we can initialize the login flow. And we can do that by calling the init login flow method. So in that case, the user will be redirected to Google. The user will insert his credentials at Google, and Google will redirect the user back to our application, and our application will get an access token. So in the other case, when we have a valid access token, we can load the user profile from Google. Then we can put an else here and use the OAuth service again. And then we can call load user profile. So when we get the user profile, I simply print this in the console for debug purpose. That's it for the configuration part. I am injecting my Google API service into a component, so it is being instantiated, and the service does the OAuth service configuration. And now we can try out our Angular app. So I will open my locally running Angular app. I open the debug console. And also you see I am being redirected to Google. And here I must insert my account. Insert the password. And yeah, the login was successful. You see I am in my Angular app. I can add some text here to show that it is actually my Angular app. So what you can see is I am in my app. I have the user info printed out in the console. If you check out the network and refresh, then you see that the application is trying to get the discovery document from Google. And you see how that discovery document looks like. It has several informations like the issuer, this is Google, some endpoints. This is the user info endpoint where we get the user info, some other things like supported flows and etc. In the console we see our user profile printed out. So I have extended my application for a bit to actually consume the user info data. I have created an interface, so I am able to pass the user info and access individual fields. Like I want to have the email address and the name and the picture. Also I need the sub. The sub is like an identifier for the user. And I need that identifier to access Gmail from that user. Also the Google service provides a subject where he puts the user info, and this can be consumed by other components. So instead of printing out the user info in the console, I am putting the user info in the user profile subject. I have also added some methods to check whether I'm logged in, and I have also added a method to sign out, so to log out at Google. On the component side, I am subscribing to the user info, and in the HTML template I'm checking whether the user is logged in, and then I'm putting some text here to welcome the user, displaying the name, email, and displaying the picture of the user, and also providing a logout button. So this is the result. This is how the app looks like now. I have all this information here, the username, the email. There seems to be an issue with the picture. If you go to the network, you see the application is trying to load the picture. The weird thing is, if I open the picture URL directly here, then I am able to load the picture. I have it here, and then when I refresh my application, I also have the picture. I don't know the reason for that error, but at least you know the picture URL is provided in the user info. There's also another issue. If we try to log out, it appears the logout has not worked. If we refresh the page after the logout, our user is still logged in. It appears that the OAuth service does not know how to log out. I don't see a logout URL in the discovery document. We can actually set the logout URL manually. We can go to the configuration of the service. After we configure it with our configuration object, we can use the OAuth service, and then we can manually set the logout URL. And after some research in the internet, I found out that this is the logout URL for Google. So after we have set the logout URL by ourselves, the logout with the OAuth service should work. Now I can try out the logout. I just click on logout from Google, and you see I am redirected back to Google and I am logged out. So if I open my locally running application again, then I am redirected back to Google again and I need to sign in. You also should know that the login at Google is a single sign-in. So if I use my Angular app to log in at Google, I am also automatically logged in all other Google applications. I can demonstrate you that with YouTube. So I am here at YouTube. I refresh here and I'm not logged in. If I click on sign in, Google asks me to sign in. I go back to my local Angular application. Then I'm logging in at Google. Now I'm logged in via Google in my Angular app. Then go to YouTube and refresh. I'm still not logged in. But if I click on sign in, I am automatically logged in again. You see? And if I go back to my application, I log out at Google. I go to YouTube again, then refresh. And now I'm not logged in at YouTube anymore. The last thing I want to demonstrate is we can use the access token of the user and access any Google API on behalf of that user. And I want to do that with the Gmail API. I want to get a list of all emails of that user in Gmail and display them in my Angular application. So this is the Gmail API documentation. We have a method to get a list of emails. This is the URL. We need to have the user ID. The user ID is this sub attribute in the user info. With this list URL, we get a list of email IDs. We don't get the actual content of the emails. For that, we have the get method. So we can get each email by ID. We need to have the email ID and the user ID again. For each call of these URLs, we need to provide the access token as a bearer token in the authorization header. So again, I have extended my application for a bit. I have the Gmail base URL. This is the base URL. And I have also included the HTTP client. I've also created two methods. One method is to get the list of email IDs by a user ID. So I create this URL and provide the user ID. Then I have a method to get an email by user ID and email ID. And as you can see, for each of the HTTP calls, I am providing the authorization header. The authorization header is structured as following. It's the authorization header key, then it has the bearer prefix, and then we have the access token from Google. I think the best practice in Angular is to do this via an HTTP interceptor. For the sake of this tutorial, I just did it the simple way. In the HTTP interceptor approach, you must make sure that you add the access token only in the Google API URLs. In my base component, I am providing a button to get the emails from that user and displaying the snippets of the emails as a list. Remember that we can use the Gmail API only if we have enabled it in the Google Cloud Console for our project. We must make sure that our application actually has the rights to access the Gmail API. For that, we must provide our app a specific scope so it can read the emails from Gmail. There are several scopes for the Gmail API. The one that is good enough for us is this Gmail read-only scope. So we copy that whole scope code, and then in our OAuth service configuration, in this OAuth config object, we have the section for scopes, and we simply add the Gmail read-only scope code. What that means is our application tries to acquire the scope. The user must give his consent, so the application is able to use that scope on behalf of the user. And now we can actually try that out. So we open our local Angular application again. And then we log in again. And then you see some consent text. Google tells me that this application is currently in a test stage. So I click OK. And the consent screen tells me that this application tries or wants to access emails. I, as a user, must give the permission to that application, and then I say, yes, I trust that application. And then I am in my Angular app again, and then I can try to read the emails. And as you see, I have gotten the email snippets from Gmail. So I can go to the real Gmail application. And you see, these are the emails, and I see them all in my Angular app. So that works. I can even try to send an email to me. So I'm sending an email to myself. That's me. And then I list emails, and I see my test mail here. Okay, so that concludes the video. Now you have a baseline to create a Google login using OpenID Connect with Angular. And I hope you liked the video, and see you in the next one.